fines. This story shows that even though Colombian Competition Authority, and I'm quoting the OECD on this, has had deficiency in terms of legislation and lacked resources during its history, competition system deserves applauses and has made a lot of progress in recent years. And that's what this operation of the last 10 to 15 years is all about. Of course, we still have a long way ahead of us. We need new legislation. I agree with that. We really need new legislation in this. Upcoming changes in the new government, and meeting the expectation, of course, of citizens and other bodies of the government that have a great amount of attention and expectation of the NSIC's activities. But as I started with, Colombia will benefit a great deal with cooperating with authorities in a similar stage. But I strongly believe that our evolution and our history can serve others in a similar situation to overcome the challenges. And actually, as Christian mentioned, our history could also serve OECD efforts of outreaching non-OECD members to overcome the challenges. Colombia may serve as an example of how to get here. I think, like as Christian mentioned, some other authorities thinking about accessing or just having an authority with OECD standards may be thinking, okay, how Colombia go there? And this is the first thing that I believe Colombia can offer to the OECD. The second is about our broad scope of competition law. The world competition community is revolving around the topic of how to analyze these novel and non-traditional conducts that are arising, especially in the digital markets. So, match pricing algorithms, e-commerce, big data analytics, blockchain and cryptocurrencies, unilateral disclosure of information. And there is no real clear question for that, because those new conducts, by definition, are unilateral, and most of the times are conducted by non-dominant undertakings in the market. So, as it can reflect in the OECD roundtables and articles, competition authorities are really struggling to find appropriate remedies to this kind of conducts that, according to the majority of the economic commentators, could be as harmful to an economy as cartels are. Some competition authorities are dealing with this problem, trying to fit these new types of anti-competitive conduits in what they have. So they're trying to use coordination or tacit collusion theories to say that this is kind of a cartel. Or they're trying to use market power theories to treat them as an abuse of dominance. But this is, in my opinion, not the right approach. They're trying to fit something that is not meant for that. And other authorities, for instance, Australia, has already amended the legislation. They have passed regulatory amendments designed to tackle unilateral information and price signaling. What will be the results of that? Well, we'll have to wait for it. However, and this is my opinion, Colombia, since 1959, has the necessary tools to evaluate and to analyze and even to tackle this kind of new practices. I believe that the general clause and the non-dominant unilateral acts prohibition provides us with the necessary tool that most all other competition authorities in the world are missing. Although they are rarely used, provisions like the general clause and the non-dominant prohibition of unilateral anti-competitive acts have given the SIC the opportunity to investigate non-conventional conducts, as, for instance, the factoring case that it was initiated last year by the SIC. This is a very good example of non-dominant conducting some unilateral acts. They have tremendous impact in the internal market, and it has tremendous impact for the small and medium enterprises. We also use these tools also to tackle a really harmful conduct for the bid rig, for the public procurement, which is the single control bid rigging cases. And we also use it as to punish price increase influence. It is certainly challenging for a competition regime to have this broad set of capacity, of provisions, but also to adequately balance them as to avoid the risk of extra limitations on undue market intervention. In Colombia, I believe, this is of course my opinion, there has been an adequate implementation and an adequate use of this set of provisions. And it comes for four reasons. First, there is a constitutional and legal limits of its implementation. In fact, the OCDE, and I will quote here, mentions that one of the strongest points about the Colombian competition regime is the constitutional hierarchy that allows an equilibrated interpretation between protection of competition and other rights. Second, there is judicial review by higher courts. Third, there is an active participation of the academia and private practitioners, which keep the SIC in check. But most important is that, and that relates to the top management and the right management that I was mentioning before, is that the SIC had decided to have a conservative and exceptional use of these provisions, a responsible application of these provisions. This is the key to everything. It doesn't matter how many legal limitations you have, doesn't matter if you have judicial review, if the SEC is responsible on applying these provisions, there is nothing to be done. Gladly, the SEC has been really conservative on applying these provisions. So far, our competition system has not been triggered to investigate those practices that I previously mentioned, like the algorithms or big data analytics. But as I mentioned before, the cases that I just presented are the testimony that we have on our broad scope of the law, the tools and experience to analyze those conducts whenever they may come. Many jurisdictions still hesitate to broaden their competition framework due, as I mentioned, for the risk to fear the risk of undue market intervention. But I believe Colombia's experience and application of the law could serve OECD as a parameter and as a, in my opinion, a successful example on how this broader competition enforcement provision could be adequately applied in country. And the third point that I would like to address, it comes with something that was also mentioned by Christian, and it's about objectives and how to shape competition authority into a country's specific needs. I remember when I started my master's degree, and I started studying seriously competition, I learned that, for instance, US has this evolution of objectives. First, they wanted to dismantle trust, then they wanted to protect local companies, then they wanted to protect efficiency, and now they are really focused on protecting and fostering innovation. The European Union paid a great deal of attention of integration of the European market. And then my question were, okay, what about Latin America? What makes us different? What makes Colombia different from them? What we're doing different to shape this, of course, tremendous tool, which is protecting competition, but to shape it to meet our specific needs. And it's very important, especially for developing countries, to ask this question and to shape their own system. For instance, South Africa has combined the application of competition law with racial integration. Brazil has made some good advancements on tackling corruption and anti-competitive practice on public procurement. So what about Colombia? Colombia has adapted to the country-specific needs in two matters. The first one is by focusing on tackling corrupt conduct on essential goods for the most vulnerable people. Diapers, not sugar, cement. This is all the kind of products that affect the most vulnerable people, the poorest people in the country. But second, by allocating an enormous, and this is really recent, an enormous portion of its resources and efforts to detect, investigate, and dismantle anti-competitive practice in public procurement. I will focus the last part of my presentation on the latter. The ultimate goal of competition law is to promote a better economic performance, protect fair, and to, of course, foster fair and effective markets. Public infrastructure projects in Colombia equal to 35.7% of the total government expenditures. In Colombia, Colombia has one of the worst indices of corruption in the world. Out of a list of 100 countries, Colombia was granted position number 10, being one of the worst countries regarding corruption and perception of corruption. Corruption costs us 4% of the GDP, equals for like almost $18 billion a year. Yet, somehow, before 2016, despite some important decisions that were issued, bid rigging or collusion in public procurement were playing a secondary role. That changed in 2016 when the SEC recognized that the old Colombian society and a stricter and more efficient enforcement effort regarding bid rigging and public procurement and competitive practices. And then, by a decision of the superintendent and with the support of the Ministry of Economy, they decided to create the specialized group, the specialized task force for investigating bid rigging. And this example can serve the OECD in three ways. First, our organizational expertise. How do you create a task force like the one that is already delivering some really good results? Second, how have we refined our investigative techniques for public procurement? Like specifically, how do you investigate public procurement cases? And third, the detection of non-traditional anti-competitive practice after this almost 2 years of work. So how do you put together a team, a working team like this one? I will tell you how we did it, and I think this is a valuable experience to share to the OECD. So first, again, we needed resources. There were not enough resources in the SEC, so they teamed up together with the Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Defense allocated $2.3 million per year to the SEC to use them as for the task force. Then, human resources. If you are committed to tackle anti-competitive practices in public procurement, you cannot do it with 1, 2, or 3 person team. You really need to be serious about this. So the team was completed by 51 professionals from different fields. This is also really important. You won't make much difference if you have 55 lawyers working on those cases. You need engineers to understand how bridges and roads are built. You need economists, of course. You need accountants. You need public business administrators. And therefore, the superintendency went out to the market to look for those types of professionals to work at task force. Second, how to pick them. So it wasn't, they weren't handpicked by any and due process. This was a competitive process of over 4 months. More than 1,300 people applied for a position in the task force. 144 were pre-selected, and then finally 55 of them were selected to serve there. The group is directed by a coordinator, which was one star seat official, and then it is divided into two leaderships. One of them is in charge of the most experienced SIC official in public procurement, and the other one by me. The whole group is divided into small teams, and this is really important. Whenever you want to deliver very good results in a timely manner, you have to allocate responsibilities to people. So what we did is one team, one case. So we assemble small teams, 4 or 5 professionals, and say, okay, this is your case. We will talk about this in 6 months, and we really need to you really need to show us some results. And of course, team selection, case selection, depending on the social impact, economic impact, and economic legal relevance. Right now, there are being under study over 170 cases, and the superintendent is fully committed to deliver measurable results and to be accountable for them. Then it comes our refined investigative techniques for public procurement cases, and it comes also with some resources. First of all, new forensic equipment and personnel. It is very, very difficult to conduct an anti-competitive investigation if you don't have the forensic resources. If you don't have the resources to watch and to see communications and to extract email and to analyze them in a timely manner, it will be impossible to put together or to deliver some results. And this is something very, very, very important. An authority has to be very aware of the difference from a private cartel, for call it somehow, like sugar or any other cartel in the private market, and cartels on public procurement. There is a massive difference between how cartels in one market behaves than they behave in the others. To investigate public procurement cartels, you have to be aware that it's not good enough just to analyze one single contract. You have to go back and analyze at least a decade, 2 decades of this specific market participant behavior in the market for the last 10 to 20 years, and then try to connect how they are paying and what is the remuneration, for instance, when someone decides to exit a building. He has to be remunerated by somehow, whether subcontracting or he's allocated another contract. So you have to see a big picture. The third point on this is that some authorities, and of course the SEC sometimes, make the mistake to rush into the dawn rates and to try to go and conduct the dawn rates as soon as possible, and that's a terrible mistake because you don't know what are you looking for. So take your time, make your investigation, analyze 10, 20, 50, whatever, as many years as you need, and then you shoot your dawn rates. And then this leads us to the detection of non-traditional anti-competitive practices, which I think will be interesting also for the OECD, like coordination and hidden control, which occurs when one person that controls 2 or 3 companies and just place them as apparent independent competitors in a bidding process, as to increase their chances to be successful in the bidding process. This, of course, distorts competition because place competitors in a in a disadvantage. Another novel kind of conflict is the boycott. What happens when the participants of public procurement decide to boycott the process in order to force the contracting entity to modify the business conditions and to, for instance, increase prices. There are also some cases that we are dealing now of private competitors to exit the bidding process. And they have like this supra-private bidding bid between them and say, okay, who is willing to pay the rest of us the much more money for the contract, and say like, okay, here's $50 million. All right, we share this and we will exit the bid, and you get the contract at the 100% of the public budget. From companies, abuse of joint venture, market sharing, all of those are somehow sophisticated bid rigging methods that we have been unveiling, and that you can, and the OECD can study from our decisions. Of course, it has led to some early good results. Just last year, the task force initiated and advanced investigations of an equal number of investigations than those that were developed by the SSE in the last 2 decades. 2017, there were 12 cases of bid rigging, although over the last 2 decades there were only 12 cases of bid rigging. So this is to conclude that for any jurisdiction or any member of the OECD wanting to put together a team or wanting to focus on tackling bid rigging and anti-competitive practices on public procurement cases, I believe they should look at Colombia's experience, and I'm sure the SEC will be very, very much happy to share our experience and help others to follow the same path. And this is all for now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so we will have a few minutes for some questions. I don't know if the audience wants to have questions about
or comments.
Or maybe
I do have a question. Like, something that rises, at least my attention, is that we see between the analytic aspects of the panel that there is almost like a pendular movement in which the private sector either is abused or the abused one by the legislations and the political parameters in which we are all being subjected in regards to competition laws and policies. My question is, how can we implement an effective development of the laws and policies in a manner in which neither being abused or being the abuser contains the reality in which we are developed? How do we balance a development in which we can be more effective in a real platform, in which we don't have to be in these pendular and constant movements, but rather in a more effective manner? How do we communicate these aspects of public policies and law development?
Who wants to answer that question?
Who wants to answer? Christian.
Would you start the answer or shall I? Sure, I think it's a very, very important question.
Yeah, of course, just like you,
yeah, let me just, I think it's a very important question, and I think, Alfonso, some of his remarks when it comes to, from a private practitioner's perspective, what the potential issues are, opportunities to be heard, I think we've heard with regard to a number of investigations that we've experienced, what can be things, competition system can include into our daily apparatus, or just the functioning of it that could be helpful and in the long term could improve whole functioning of the agency. I think one very important thing to keep in mind, and the OECD actually has been doing a lot of work in that regard, is how particular safeguards and procedure of fairness rules and provisions can be kind of like secured or made sure that they are part of the system through work with different local authorities as well. The International Competition Network, the ICN, has done over the last few years, over the last 4 or 5 years, has done a series of discussions and then also came up with policy papers focusing on exactly on the issue that you had mentioned. Throughout the investigations process, how we can include the procedural safeguards into place so that, as Alfonso mentioned, we are not in the position that perhaps we have to accuse ourselves, that we can defend ourselves, so that hopefully address something that we don't even know whether we would in the end be asked about. All of that actually will be one of the OECD does something called long-term themes as well. In addition to individual roundtables, some of which I talked about, merger remedies, leniency and coordination of leniency programs, pharmaceuticals and generic pharmaceuticals issues, state and enterprise, a number of individual topics that we regularly discuss as part of roundtables. We also do something called long-term themes or kind of like long-term projects through a cluster of roundtables and series of sessions and discussions, we discuss particular aspects of one key topic. Over the last few years, international cooperation has been one. What hinders international cooperation? What are the key challenges that we all face working with other jurisdictions and how we can improve upon those? The one that we will actually start, and exactly based on the fact as well that you brought it up, in more and more countries, procedure fairness issues have risen to the top of the agenda. Private practitioners have raised a number of these issues. Exactly the same types that Alfonso mentioned. The right to be heard, the right to present evidence, the right to discuss the particular matter with agency officials, and not just hear about a particular decision that one actually is being investigated. And the OECD starting next year embarks now on a procedure of fairness series of roundtables addressing particular issues in that regard. Be transparency of decision making, be the right to engage with the agency. And it will likely be like a 2-year process, a 2-year project. Likely at the end of it, there will be some kind of key work product, perhaps a recommendation, some of which we have already discussed, in the merger area, in the conduct area. Maybe the OECD will end up creating some kind of recommendation on procedure of fairness that can serve as best practices or guidance or standards that agencies can look to and aspire to. And I think now, as a full member of the OECD, the Colombian experience and the SICB participating in meetings will be very important. I want to add one last point on this. This is, if we talk about competition enforcement matters, so there are similar issues and similar concerns in almost all jurisdictions. So it's not one country, not one competition system that faces these types of issues. Perhaps they are somewhat different, in for example, how the investigation is conducted, how some of the issues that Alfonso mentioned, perhaps the adjudicative part versus the decision-making part is by practitioners conceived as too close together. But in most agencies' practice, in most jurisdictions, similar issues surface, and as their role, private practitioners do raise them regularly. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent question. And then what I would say, after having devoted most of my adult life to the study of competition law, that we should not despair because there are pendular movements. There will be pendular movements. But I think that this kind of exercise, analyzing, bringing international experts, studying the best practices of other countries, this is what will help us create a better competition law for our country. And I think that we have, this is new for us, this is new. Competition law was not born in Latin America. We need to give it a Latin voice. We need our own voice, an antitrust that is appropriate for the size of our economies, for the idiosyncrasy of our peoples, and to promote the values of antitrust that will better the lives of the population. This is the goal. And I always remember one of my favorite documents in antitrust is this very long article that Professor Kovacic wrote on the history of American antitrust, and he uses the parable of golden fleece to say how the DOJ has gone, and then like it happened to Ricitos de Oro, the soup was too hot, and then it was too cold, and then it was in the middle, and the bed was too big, and was too small, and the chair was too big. So the authority has to go an evolution process, and we have to study, we have to make good critique, we have to try to steer to a better antitrust that is more fair and produces better results. But we should not despair because there are pendular movements, because such is history.
Yeah, I have a specific question for Christian. It's regarding agenda setting in the OECD. Right now, most of the committees in the OECD are undergoing through a 3-year process where they have already the agenda set, and it's a cycle. So most of the roundtables will have a new agenda by 2020. However, there are other committees like the Liberalization Committee, which deals with competition advocacy and the Program for Effective Market Reform, that have a new agenda next year, and that they do work a lot with non-members with the OECD. So my curiosity would draw for what would be the role of Colombia in agenda setting in these new rounds that are starting, and specifically with regards to competition advocacy, being a country that has such a rich experience and comes with all new ideas to the OECD.
Sure, thank you for that excellent question. When it comes to the priority setting within the OECD Competition Committee, it's kind of like, as you mentioned, on a longer term in general, when we identify topics or at least key issues that we would like to discuss over a longer period of time. And that's often over a 2 or 3 year period. When it comes to the key kind of like documents and the step-by-step process within the OECD, there's something called Program of Work and Budget, PWB, which takes place on a dual 2-year cycle. So for example, we over the last few years, over the last few months, agreed on what will take place within the Competition Committee over 2019-20. As part of the long-term topic that I mentioned on procedural fairness, there was agreement among the membership that this would be a topic worth exploring, going into details on, and try to kind of like have as a key focus for a number of sessions, a cluster of roundtables built around different aspects of procedural fairness. Interesting, and it's an excellent question that you asked right now. One of the other long-term themes for the next 2 years will be exactly, market studies and competition advocacy. So there will be, again, a series of sessions focusing on that. And that can be, starting from issues from, for example, how do you pick industries, sectors that you, as an agency, will want to focus on for market study purposes. What kind of complaints you receive, what kind of, experience you hear, what, based on your experience and investigations, when do you get to the point where you think, we have had a number of investigations in this particular sector, perhaps we could look into it deeper as well, if structurally there are some competitive issues in this space. Be, as in a number of countries, the cement sector, or financial services, or telecommunications, or any of those industries. So Colombia, in that regard, will be a very important addition now to the OECD membership, providing its own vast experience in competition advocacy matters, and then talk about market studies and other advocacies with regard to government, with regard to kind of like proposals to change laws, proposals even before laws will be enacted as proposals, to make changes in that regard. Perhaps there's some way to achieve the same kind of goals from a competition perspective with less of a restriction for the consumers and for the competitive process. But also, in addition to these longer term topics, many of the kind of like short-term topics, short-term issues, short-term projects the Competition Committee does, basically is just at the end of the meetings, countries can raise their flags and say, we have been experiencing issues in the IP area, focusing on, say, standard essential patents. Would there be interest among the other members to discuss this at the upcoming next session? And if there's sufficient support for a particular topic, again, members, each and every of them can raise their flag and have the opportunity to weigh in. there will be, in addition to the longer topics that we have previously agreed upon, it's important we always keep it flexible enough, because as we know, in the competition landscape, there can be significant developments within weeks or months that perhaps needs to be addressed at the next meeting in 6 months or 12 months' time, and we may not want to just schedule things 3 years from now. By that time, the topic may be moved. You know, the topic that we are looking at and we are trying to address now, the challenges we were faced with today, if we would discuss it in 3 years, thank you, but we have other priorities right now, you know, so or other like key agenda items in our enforcement or advocacy, like agenda that we, instead of what we talked about a few years ago, would focus on. So it's very important to keep that level of flexibility, like even in the long-term topics, perhaps we think that there is something very important to talk about on how to engage with the agencies. Maybe we plan 2 or 3 sessions around that topic, but if we feel that after one meeting, we've heard from most members, and there is a consensus around the table that we have explored this topic, then we can move on to the next one that is, you know, the current hot button topic, and we can schedule meetings or discussions around that.
I have 2 questions. The first one is, what do you think the OECD can offer us, especially to the Congress, regarding the adoption of a new competition law that includes levels of fines, the leniency programs, among other competition aspects? And the other one goes for Christian. Is there usually an active participation from other state bodies, like the Congress, in the hearings or the roundtables of the OECD?
Yeah, I think that it is very important to convey to the government and to the legislators the recommendations, the experience of the OECD, because I don't know if there is a direct level of interaction, but I have never seen that. But I think that the authority can canalize what the recommendations have been. There is the peer review process. There is all that Felipe explained. And I think that the authority and the practitioners, the academics, should talk to the legislator and participate in the legislative process and be heard and provide the soundest advice so that we get to the best possible modification of the law. We have seen that in the past. Decree 2153 was implemented and prepared by a very, very concrete number of people. But this was a very special time. It was immediately after the Constitution. But then if you see the process of the discussion of Law 1340, it was a very open discussion. And the law started like with 6 articles, and it ended with a very important reform. So what we have to make sure is that we tell them, because the congressmen, the politicians, they don't really know. They have their advisors, and they have their political agendas, they have their constituency, their friends, their enemies. So it's important that the academics, the authority who is very technical, who has the long-run picture of competition law, can convey the best practices, the best things that should be in these reforms to the competition law, in my view.
I fully agree with Alfonso's points on that. When it comes to the particular question you had on participation within the OECD Competition Committee, I think we talked about it before, that it's mostly, you know, the competition agencies and the top competition officials from the member countries and from the observer countries attending the meetings and participating in the meetings. You know, the Competition Committee was established, it was one of the first ones that was established, you know, within the OECD immediately. I think Christina mentioned that the organization was established in 1961. In 1962, immediately afterwards, the Competition Committee was established too, one of the first ones within the organization. And since then, I think there was a lot of trial and error, you know, over the last several decades, even in who participates or who engages in the meetings. I think what we come to have today is kind of like a result of that development. All the countries that send people, you know, to the meetings, they may have experience with different folks, different staff members, different agencies being present. But I think what we have today is a natural evolution of having the competition experts around the table to discuss those particular issues. If there is something like an accession review or a broader peer review that we talked about, of course, Congress or so can, back in the capital, play a role in it or so. And then, as Felipe discussed, there were endless discussions between what were recommended by the OECD and what could then be implemented within Colombia or within a particular member country from those recommendations. And of course, in that regard, Congress and the political process plays a crucial role in that. But as a general matter, we found that when it comes to roundtable discussions or so, folks who do it on a daily basis, competition officials or so, usually have the best result or so for the country as well that participates in the meetings. And of course, they bring back the knowledge, the experience, the discussions, and the know-how that, again, within a particular country can, again, hopefully improve the system. When it comes to particular country-specific projects that we talked about, of course, Congress can be involved, or congressmen can be involved in different ways when it comes to proposals being discussed, competition assessment issues in different countries. Right now, the OECD is running, for example, a project in Ukraine to try to see if, through changing, some of the laws, some of the regulations, some of the practices, some of the rules the country has, there's a better way to achieve the same, competition objectives, competition goals with a less restrictive mean. Then, in that regard, they do have discussions. The Secretary of Folks were involved in it, and last year I myself was also working on some of these issues in Ukraine. Had meetings with Congress members who on some of these important topics. It's very helpful to bring it to congressmen and congresspeople's attention as well, what the issues are that we are working right now on in the competition community. But as a general matter, it's more relevant to these types of projects or what we talked about in the peer review examples or so. We had, for example, the Brazil experience I mentioned before. Of course, we talked about in detail the accession review process with Colombia. But for example, last year there was a similar process. Vietnam is going through a significant reform in its competition system. And again, in discussions with their own Congress, they brought folks who were again peer reviewed, and their agency and some other sector regulators as well participated in the peer review process. That whatever recommendations the membership then made, they took them back to the capital and they discussed it further with the politicals.
I have a question for Felipe actually, and then we have to move on because we have a plane to catch. But in my presentation, I was referring to our broad legal capacity, as the general clause in the unilateral non-dominant acts. I see them as an opportunity, actually an opportunity that is so relevant that we should share it to the OECD. Maybe, probably they should learn from us. But it's also being perceived as a risk of extra limitation. So I'm wondering, when you were presenting Colombian competition law and you explained those provisions to them, how were those provisions perceived? More like a risk, more like an opportunity?
That's a good question, but I think it was actually not a focus on, neither the committee nor the Jay Schaefer, who did the peer review, focused very much on it. And I do agree with you, it's a special provision, unilateral acts performed by non-dominant agents as an antitrust violation. But it wasn't actually a discussion. Or at least a deep discussion within the framework of the peer review. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I would like to, for Carlos and Christian to answer this. Having in mind the problem that corruption means for Colombian society, and which is why the reason perhaps different entities of the government try to attack it in its own way, like for the Fiscalía and the criminal side, and of course, in the competition matter, the SIC. What would be a common ground between the competition law and criminal law, without taking one or the other out of the way, to attack this bid-rigging and all the collusions, having in mind that they are the first steps to what comes next and all the problems on the contractual problems that come afterwards, that are the ones that cost us all the money that, well, the state is losing and we're losing at the other end. So what would you both think that could work between the Fiscalía and the SIC without taking the other of the way to find common ground to attack these problems and these issues?
Yeah, well, I don't think you have to choose between one of them. All that is needed is effective, but especially mandatory agencies coordination. What happened now is that the SEC wants to coordinate with the Fiscalia, and the Fiscalia wants to coordinate with the agency, but we don't have neither the tools or the obligation to do so. And actually, Alfonso was making some remarks on that. If you apply for a leniency program in the SIC, we'll say, okay, well, congratulations, you're not going to be fined. But then if it's going to say, congratulations, you may go to jail. And this is something that really we should think about and we should work on. Actually, one of my students who is back there is conducting an investigation on that specific matter. And it is really difficult with this state of the art, with the state of our legislation, to be sure. I believe, we haven't discussed in a while, so I don't know what's your opinion right now, but I believe some legislation amendments are needed to make cooperation mandatory for board of agencies and leniency benefits immediately applied to both proceedings. Otherwise, it will make no sense to further try to coordinate. If it is not like a deep legislation change, I would prefer the state of things as they are. Like, okay, there are two independent agencies that can investigate the same conduct, and that's it.
I fully agree with what Carlos said, but I also wanted to say, I don't think there's going to be like one size fits all, one recipe, one solution for these types of issues. When we have discussions about this, you see the same issues, the same concerns popping up again in a number of countries. So my quick answer is just one word: cooperate. And whatever form, shape, that would take, you just want to make sure that you within the limits of law, of course, you coordinate with the other agency the particular investigation. You share information you can share. And again, in different countries, different jurisdictions, among different agencies, that can take many different ways and shapes and forms. In some jurisdictions, perhaps the same types of investigations are handled by the same agency. In Sweden, the Competition Authority, for example, also does public procurement. We've heard about, the bid rigging task force and its activities, within the SIC, and how immediately it's been a very successful addition to the competition apparatus that the agency has. Even within, just like within this area, there are a number of jurisdictions where perhaps the list is much longer. Who participates in investigations? The Competition Authority, sure. The public prosecutor, sometimes say if it's in financial services, the local SEC, kind of like whether it's a Securities and Exchange Commission or some kind of like financial services body or sector regulator, the police, whoever. Sometimes you have to coordinate among 5, 6 different agencies and bodies and arms of government, Department of Justice, others. So of course, the more complex this cooperation is, the more difficult it is to achieve good results. But based on the number of examples from all the countries, based on the difficulties, I don't think we can kind of like have a short, quick recipe to resolve these issues, other than please make sure you keep each other informed, and then make sure that you don't do things that are hopefully absolutely completely insolvable or like different from each other at thought. So it's a very good question, a very complex issue that I think government agencies have to deal with on a daily basis.
I think that we have only time for the 2 final questions. I have one petition here, and then Ildiko Gede, one of our full-time professors, is here. She's from Hungary.
Okay, I wanted to ask Christian, in your opinion, which is the best tool in order for Colombia to contribute and influence other competition regimes or other competition authorities around the world?
I think, all the things that we've discussed today could be summarized with kind of like show your experience and discuss those what you've had. I mentioned that before, and I really like when Carlos mentioned how important it is to hire the right people, whether it's management, whether it's staff members, it's people who will do the job. It's people who need the expertise, the experience, who will run the investigations, who will be faced with the challenges and the issues, and who need to make judgments and decisions in particular matters. So you literally cannot underscore the importance of how important it is to hire the right people. But once you have that, and it seems that fortunately, Colombia has achieved that, when you think about moving forward or influencing or being relevant and being in touch with other agencies, what you have done, I think Alfonso talked about this as well, that what you have done, whether it's advocacy-related activities, whether it's cases, whether it's now recent activities of the bid rigging task force, that is experience that can be extremely relevant for others who are thinking about how to address this particular issue, how to deal with this challenge. And all that the OECD does is kind of like making sure that you bring this experience and expertise together. I remember when, similarly to your question, whether it's, we call it influencing or whether it's showing a good example for other jurisdictions, when a few years ago there was a session at the OECD on how to go after cartel cases. In many jurisdictions, you have successful leniency programs. So someone knocks on the door, says, I have something to tell you. Oh, please come on in, let's discuss. That will be a leniency applicant, hopefully, from an enforcer's perspective as well, it will lead to some investigation that in the end, will resolve some issues in the marketplace. What happens when your leniency program is not successful? How can you increase, the number of applicants? And most importantly, what happens even if your leniency program is successful, you want to look behind it. You know that there can be serious competition issues in sectors, but you simply cannot uncover that. It's very difficult, today to discover cartel activity. And at this particular OECD session, I still remember, I'm originally from Hungary. I was born there and I grew up there. And the Hungarian delegate said, we were faced with the same issue. No one knocked on the door. We had a task force, 20 people, 15 that we thought would be active going after cartels. They don't have much to do because we don't know how to learn about topics and then the issues in the marketplace. So what they did, they hired a couple of people who were previously, in the police force, who had investigative experience. And they may not have looked at competition issues before, but they knew how to uncover and detect different, whether it's in the financial service sector, whatever industry it is, wrongdoings. And I think Carlos mentioned how important it is to have people from different backgrounds in that regard. Have expertise, folks who know something about, if it's an accounting issue, they immediately can react to that. If it's, people who maybe in investigations in the media sector, maybe someone who worked in that particular field before, who provides in-house expertise within the agency without getting to a roadblock. Perhaps that investigation wouldn't continue, but we have someone on staff who has done something like that before. And there's an issue here. And they immediately can provide that kind of experience and expertise to the investigation. It's an ongoing process. We always have to evaluate what we have, what perhaps we need more, and try to kind of respond to those, as with the hiring of the staff members of the bid rigging task force. But the most important project or part, I think, is completely assess what you have. We respond to tomorrow's challenges as well.
We will look for a former police officer.
Now for the last question, Ildiko, please.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you, how do you see the importance of free trade agreements, and in the free trade agreements, the regulation of competition policy, which is very much like without treaty force, without the importance in the free trade agreements. How do you see, like in any case, this topic moving into the free trade agreements, and especially in CETA, kind of the European Union? How do you see, is there any importance, is there any place for competition regulation in the free trade agreements, or this is merely a little bit moving on cooperation between competition authorities?
Is the question maybe go
to you, please? Yeah.
Or to me, thank you. Sure, it's a very good one. I think we all see now more and more, in the daily press as well, how trade and competition as areas that are relevant and are interdisciplinary, how they can interact. So I think what we basically view it as they complement each other. When we think about different policy areas, I think I mentioned it before, we really have to focus on the interdisciplinary issues. Consumer protection is not only consumer protection. It has ramifications and implications in other areas, data privacy, competition, perhaps trade, investment, all of that. Trade is one of those areas as well that I think we all know will touch upon so many other relevant policy areas, including very important competition. And actually within the OECD, there used to exist a working group on trade and competition, which I think was disbanded about 2002 or so, again focusing on the exact same issues. We all know there's an interface between those two policy areas. How do we view that? And then what are we doing when it comes to different parts of government dealing with either trade or competition issues, and whether, again, we can do something more to make sure that there's a smooth interface among these policy areas. Specifically regarding your question, Ligo, the free trade agreements most often have competition provisions as well. So we usually, over the last few years as well, the United States, entering into free trade agreements, there's usually a section or a few provisions focusing on competition as well. Those competition provisions usually highlight the importance of cooperation, and of course, the parties that, the parties are to the treaty, you always want to include that when it comes to the internet, the intellectual property issues, when it comes to competition provisions. There are committee issues, and you actually have that level of, provisions within free traders. I think we will likely see that going forward, that this will be very important, include and continue to include in free trade agreements or so. We will see whether the language or the types of provisions will change in any regard. They're really high level, provisions or so, talking about the benefits of competition, importance of cooperation and coordination. But I think this will continue as part of our ongoing work when it comes to free trade agreements.
Okay. Thank you very much.